All right, so we've talked about the goal attainment models so far, Mnuchin and Beavers, and we said the major slant of those models of family systems functioning is on getting things done. What facilitates a good organization that accomplishes tasks. Be they instrumental tasks, making sure everybody is cared for, that the house is maintained, that the mortgage is paid, that money is put aside for a kid's education or whatever. And emotional or expressive tasks, making sure that individuals in the family are growing and developing to their fullest potential. And those are generally the major goals that we, broadly speaking, the major goals that families in our society, American society, have, right? And so those models look a lot like what you might find in any organizational system. What makes an organization work well? Well, rational decision making, right? Not having disruptive emotional environments, okay? Now, some of those things are easier in other organizations, so your work organizations say, well, just leave your problems at home. Turn off emotions while you're here. And if you don't, you're going to get fired. But the family can't do that, and so it's a bit of a trickier problem because they have to mesh those two goal attainment strategies. And so the Mnuchin systems and Beavers model, they both are really looking primarily at getting things done. Now, we also said they have a little element, like Mnuchin has, is response to stress. But there's not a lot in his model that says what it is that facilitates a family's ability to respond well to stress. Right? He mentions some things about being flexible, etc. The model that we're going to talk about next, rather than focusing on what gets things done, is going to focus on what facilitates the family adapting to its environment as its environment is ever-changing. And so this model is the Olson circumplex model. Now, it'll become apparent, if not today, in this lecture, then in the next lecture when we talk about measurement, why it's called the circumplex model. But just accept it for the moment, okay? This circumplex model is a family adaptation model. And so the focus is on what facilitates the system's ability to adapt to an ever-changing environment. For Olson, the environment of the family, both the internal environment, the conditions of the members, and the external environment, the parameters under which the family has to operate, the response it has to make to other organizations in the community, the educational system, the financial system, etc. For Olson, that's always in flux. It's always changing to some degree. And so he's concerned about how do families, while they're responding to these changing environments, how do they maintain balance? Because some things are going to throw it in one direction versus another. And the kind of balance they're concerned about are two types. What is the balance between stability and change? How much can the family change all the time? Or does it need some level of stability? And is there too much stability such that it can't change when it has to? And so families have to maintain this balance between having some sort of stability over time that facilitates smooth organizational functioning, but also being able to shift and change on a regular basis at the same time without going too far into the being touchy-feely and just changing it on a whim. Okay? The other is the balance between autonomy and connectedness. And so this element refers to really the expressive aspects of family life, the emotional, affective aspects of family life. And so families consist of, remember, we've talked about this several times, families consist of members who in and of themselves are systems. And so those systems need autonomy. If the family is going to be able to adapt, it's going to have to do so in a way that respects that autonomy and that facilitates it. But at the same time, it's going to have to be able to coordinate the actions of its members. So it's got this balancing act in that area as well between autonomy and connectedness. How much autonomy is good, how much connectedness is good. So in his model, he has three major dimensions. The first two are at the heart of his model for everyday functioning of families. And the third one we're going to see has to do with what he calls to a second level of adaptation. So family cohesion is the first one. What's the level of attachment, closeness, and bonding amongst the members of the family? So if you think of your own families, what would be indicators of cohesion in your family? Can you think of anything? If I would look at your family, you say, my family is pretty cohesive, or my family is not very cohesive. What kinds of things would you point to say, we're a cohesive unit? We stick together.
Is it as far as like, are you talking about like what we all like believe in is not like religiously or anything like that, but like what we believe our family should be? I don't know. So, like,
well, no, just think about your interactions with amongst the members of your family. Do you see things that pull you together?
You mean like camping trips?
Oh, camping trips. So doing things together, right?
Okay, I was gonna say like
going off into the wilderness as a unit, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I was gonna say like playing softball growing up was like a family event for us. So
Okay, family events around sporting events.
yeah.
Okay.
But
Other things?
We had family dinner every night.
Family dinner, right? Other things?
go ahead.
Friday night movie night.
Okay.
I was gonna say, even, this is weird, but no matter like how the phone conversation goes or even like text, at the end of every phone call we always say I love you, even if you're fuming at that person, you always say I love you. And
so you have some rituals that reinforce the connection.
Like it could be a terrible phone call, but you have to say it or else it'll make things worse.
because if it's a terrible phone call, it's usually because of some conflict, right?
Yeah.
And there's usually and that conflict is usually about one member wanting to be on their own and do something different than the rest. And so that's a tension that pushes apart, right? And so the saying, it's always going to say I love you at the end of the phone call, says, yeah, and there's this, but there's also this. We're still tied together. And so a lot of rituals happen in families that are there, and we'll see when we talk later about family culture. Family rituals play a big role in sustaining cohesion in families. Okay? And so the cohesiveness is about the things we do together. It's also about the way we look at each other, the way we think about each other. Okay? So if you're thinking about making a major decision in your life, who are you going to think about when you say, well, how would other people view this decision? Who are the people you're going to think about first?
Oh, I think about my parents right away.
Right. So that's saying that you're oriented towards other family members before you're oriented to people outside the family. Okay? So that's a kind of form of cohesion to the extent that other family members, all the family members, look to each other for making judgments in their life, for thinking about whether they're a good person or a bad person, for thinking about what kind of person they are. They're really referring to the reactions they get from their other family members primarily. And that would be a sign of cohesiveness. They're not just behaviorally interdependent and tied to each other. They're also cognitively and emotionally oriented towards each other. And that would be signs of cohesion. Attachment is kind of a similar idea as well. We all develop attachments in our life. In my other course in the Social 332 on human relations, we talk a lot about attachment styles. But a secure attachment is a kind of system that we develop with other people. Now, the first place we develop that is with our parents. And it's a sense of wanting to be close to them and not liking being too separated from them. Okay? So it's having that kind of closeness, and that you're really comfortable with it when you're around those people, and they're comfortable with you being close to them. You can separate to some degree, yes, but too much separation can produce some anxiety, and you don't like that, and so you're drawn to go back together again. So those are ideas of cohesion that are in Olson's model. And he says that families have to have some level of cohesion. We'll talk about how much in a minute. Okay? The second dimension is flexibility. And this refers to the ability to change the systems of control, role, responsibilities, and rules in the family. So families have a structure to them. They have a way of doing things, a way of making decisions, a way of accomplishing certain tasks. We've talked about this, taking out the garbage or washing the dishes or doing the shopping. They also have sets of rules about what you can and can't do with respect to each other in the family and while you're in the family's presence, and to some degree even outside the family's presence. And so some families have a very strong, centralized, downward-speaking control, right? One person is really sort of telling everyone what they have to do. Others have systems that are more democratic. They vote on things. They have family get-togethers, family powwows. What's the best decision we're going to make here? Some families have very segregated and rigid role organizations, right? The boys always do these things, the girls always do those things. If you get to a certain age, you get these particular rights, and you get these new responsibilities. And really, it's not appropriate, as Andrew had said last time, it's not appropriate for a girl to take the garbage out. But in your family, it was. So you would have more flexibility in your family than others. You'd have even more flexibility if sometimes you would take the garbage out and sometimes your brother would take the garbage out. And you would negotiate that whenever you needed to. If it wasn't getting taken out, the other person would do it. And there would be no problem with that, right? And everybody's sharing in the kitchen and chopping vegetables for dinner, etc. Right? Sometimes the husband does the shopping, sometimes the wife does the shopping. Right? Depending upon whatever the circumstances are. If the husband has to stay late at work, the wife does the cooking and shopping. If the kids have to go to volleyball or have to go to soccer and the mom is involved in the soccer, then the father might do the cooking. That would be a very flexible organization, wouldn't it? And so flexibility is how easy is it for a family to switch things up. And the major areas are control, who makes the decisions. Sometimes it can be this person, sometimes it can be that. Or it's always this person and it can never vary from that. We don't make a decision unless this person's present or their wishes are known. That would be very rigid, right? Sometimes it could be in the area of roles, most of the examples I just gave you. And sometimes it could be in just general rules. Some of you talked about rules about television watching when we were talking about boundary maintenance. Well, what can you watch? Okay. Are there very rigid rules? Or is it sort of a broad set of principles and you make the decision about what kind of show you watch because you know that it's consistent with your family values and beliefs as opposed to this would be disruptive of family. And people are allowed to make those decisions on their own. So that would be a more flexible kind of organization. And so these are the two major dimensions, cohesion and flexibility. And when Olson first developed the model, it was only these two dimensions. But then he came up with a third that he thought was important, not so much for everyday functioning as a family, but for those emergency situations when something drastic changes. And that means the whole system has to reorient itself, maybe change its entire set of goals. Or rather than just even a flexible system might have to become very rigid. And so the system has to be able to shift from its sort of modus operandi every day, how does it operate, to something very drastically different. How does it do that? And so he adds in the third component, which is communication. And by communication, he refers to two elements: the ability to accurately convey information from one person to another, and the level of expressiveness and responsiveness that exists in the system. Do family members feel like they can express their needs and their desires and their conditions of life to each other pretty freely, and that when they do so, do they get positive responses back? Do they get, not necessarily positive, but affirmative responses back? Okay, so there's these three dimensions. we're going to start with the first two because they're the most critical to start with, and that's cohesion and flexibility. So the underlying principle in your, just as an aside for the class today, in your slides is I switched one up. This is the third one down. Okay, I just moved it up.
Okay.
So the underlying principle in Olson's model is the idea of that optimal functioning is indicated by moderate to high levels of cohesion and flexibility. That the best families, the most functional ones, are the ones that have moderate levels or moderate to high levels of cohesion and moderate to high levels of flexibility. Now, in his original formulation of the model, again, this model is a product of many, many years of couple therapy that Olson has engaged in over his lifespan, still working today. What he argued was you could have the couples that he was seeing and the families that he was seeing that were having problems, they seemed to be on the extremes. They were, with regard to cohesion, they were either too together or they weren't together at all. Okay? They were either too engaged or too disengaged. Too engaged would have been the word he would have used, is enmeshed. Okay? And that it seemed as though all the families that he was seeing that were having problems were on the edges. And that when he did studies and he brought in control groups, the normal families seemed to be somewhere in the middle. The same is true for flexibility. They seem to either be really rigid or totally chaotic. And that there was a wide range of normality in the middle. And so he argued it's moderate levels of each is what makes for a family to be functioning. Extreme levels get families in trouble. Now, over time, people have done lots of research using his model, and they've come to a determination that, well, yes, you're right, the real extremes, the ones that wind up in therapy, are out there. But if you take the group in the middle, you can actually rank that group. Remember we talked about what's functional and normal? If you use the average, the middle, where's the cutoff point? And is high equal to low? Well, what the research has shown is that actually being in the middle, but being on the high end of cohesion and being on the high end of flexibility is actually even more optimal than being on the low end of moderate. And so the model gets revised a bit, and so now where it's at right now is families are considered to be functional if they range from moderate to high cohesion, moderate to high flexibility, with high being somewhat more optimal than low in that range. Still, the extremes are the problematic ones. Okay. So, why moderate to high cohesion? Why moderate to high flexibility? Theoretically, it makes sense. Theoretically, it makes sense. If you have moderate to high cohesion, the members of the family will have a stronger, what we can call affiliative orientation. Right? They'll want to associate with the other family members. They'll like interacting with their brothers and sisters and their parents. They'll genuinely want to do things together. At the same time, they won't feel pressured like they have to do everything with their brothers and sisters and their parents. That they have some freedom to go off on their own. Okay. And so this creates, this affiliative orientation, this cohesion level, creates independence for the individual, and that then enriches family life because each of those individuals goes out and explores the environment on their own and develops their own unique skills and perspectives on the world. And so when the family has to deal with a problem, they've got multiple perspectives. They've got multiple sets of experiences. It's not like we call an information silo. It's not just like one set of information that they rely upon. They have inputs coming from multiple perspectives. And so moderate to high cohesion facilitates that. It keeps people together, but at the same time, it gives them the autonomy to go out and have this independence and bring this new perspective into family problems. Plus, the cohesiveness provides an affective support for change without a threat to the self. The family can change, things can change in how the family is organized, and family members, they're not so tied to each other that a change in the way the family operates means there's a threat to who they are as persons. They have an independent sense of who they are. They're very well what we call self-differentiated from their families. Their families are tied, they're tied to their families, they orient to their families. The major source of what we call reflected appraisals for knowing what kind of person you are coming from the family, but they're not only coming from the family, there's other sources. And so if something changes over here and diminishes the interactions with other family members or changes the way in which the role you play in the family, it's not necessarily going to be taken personally. That facilitates the family being able to change. And being able to change is what makes for adaptation. Moderate to high flexibility is important. It creates an ability to coordinate activities without negotiation. So there is some structure. It's not just so structured, but there is structure. And structure is important. If you have a good system, then it works kind of automatically. You don't have to worry. You don't have to negotiate all the time. People understand their part that they play. And they're usually pretty happy with it. There are things they can do. The roles that they're assigned are suitable to their abilities. The levels of power that they're given and control in the family are suitable to their levels of resources and their skills and abilities. And so what happens is that results in, when you look at these families, geez, this person always seems to do those things, or these people share in this way on a regular basis. They don't seem to have to talk about who's going to do what. It kind of is understood and is done automatically. That's an indication of structure, right? Repeatable patterns of behavior. You see it happening over and over again. But it's not so patterned that there isn't an opportunity to switch things up, to change the way things are done if necessary. And so these families have a pattern of behavior, but because they're high on flexibility, they also have the ability to interchange themselves. They have interchangeable parts. Sometimes someone's going to do one thing, next time it might be somebody different. They don't have to negotiate. They understand what determines who's going to do the task at what time. There are sets of principles. It depends on what night it is and what responsibilities each person has. But they understand those things and they fit right into a change over in doing tasks. So interchangeability of members is a sign of high flexibility. In a family in which the same person takes the garbage out every day, and the same person cooks the meals every day, and the other person can't cook the meal, and the other person doesn't even know where the garbage is taken, or what day it's taken out, that family doesn't have as much flexibility. Or where one person is earning the income, and the other person, the other adult, doesn't have a clue about what it means to have a job, that would have a lot less flexibility. They're not interchangeable. Only one person can do that job. And so interchangeability of members leads to an ability to adjust in changing circumstances. What happens when the person earning the income, for some reason, loses his job or her job, or gets sick, and someone else has to take up that responsibility? Can someone move right in? What happens when someone can't cook the evening meal? Who's going to do it? How's it going to get done? Shopping for groceries, doing the taxes. If both members or multiple members understand the process, then in an extreme emergency, it's easier for one of the other members to come and take over that task. And so that's the idea of interchangeability of members, and that's why high flexibility, That would be an instance of interchangeability of members, where members are frequently exchanging the roles that they have. That tends to make the family more adaptive to changing circumstances because it can change things up as the circumstances call for. And then finally, this high flexibility means that the family is more prepared to negotiate their roles if needed. Because usually what happens is that the flexibility comes about because of negotiations. These families already know how to negotiate. They're used to it. All right, so let's go back and let's look at cohesion. For Olson, there are 5 levels of cohesion that he makes a distinction between. The first is what he says, families that are disengaged or disconnected. Okay? A disengaged or disconnected families, the members engage in activities in separate spheres of life. They don't do things together. One person goes camping, the other person goes to the motorcycle races. And another person goes to the fashion shows. And another person goes and plays soccer. They don't really do a lot of things that are in the same sphere of activity. Okay? Unlimited privacy is, listen. In this system, people are given complete freedom. Nobody cares about anybody else. Right? Do what you want. Don't bug me. Right? And so you have so much autonomy that there isn't a tie between you and the other members of the family that's very strong. You don't think about them because you're never encouraged to think about them. You're encouraged to just do it on your own. Also, extreme emotional detachment and an externalized self-concept. So these family members really don't have an emotional connection to each other. They don't have empathy with each other very much. And when they think about who they are, it doesn't matter what mom and dad or a brother or sister think. It's more what someone outside the family thinks. That's more important to them. And so this kind of family, a family that consists of members who live a life like this, is a disengaged or a disconnected family. The middle 3 categories of cohesion, as I said, remember he says the middle is what's optimal, are somewhat connected to very connected. And as you move from somewhat connected to very connected, you go from marginal overlapping spheres. You do few things together, but there's a lot of separateness in your activities, to joint spheres. You do a lot of things together. Okay? If people like different activities, that's fine, but you do them together. So we'll go to the soccer game this week, and next week we'll go camping, etc. Right? And so that would be more of a joint spheres kind of system. And that's indication of very connected. High privacy in somewhat connected. So in the somewhat connected, there's a lot of autonomy given to individuals, but it's not you're on your own. We're going to give you privacy, but you got to come back and engage. To when we get very connected, very limited private space. The idea that you need to be by yourself, why do you need to be by yourself? Yeah, we'll give you time if you really need it, but the family has a much higher priority. We should stick together. Yeah, I know you want to go off on your own, but you need to take your brother with you. Okay? That kind of idea is a sign of being very connected. And then emotional separateness to very high levels of attachment. From sort of emotional, it's not a total emotional detachment. You still care about each other, but the emotional investments aren't as high, to a condition where in the very connected, there's a lot of emotional connection, that you really are in tune with each other's emotional lives. Usually there's a lot of expression of emotional conditions and a lot of positive responsiveness that comes back from it. And then finally, and one other, supportiveness from somewhat connected. You support your other family members to, in the very connected, high identity interdependency. You really need the other family members in order to understand who you are as a person. The final level of cohesion is what he calls enmeshed or overly connected. And in these situations, you have undifferentiated spheres. This family does everything together and nobody does anything separately. They're always doing things together. No private space at all. Any attempt to find private space is considered to be disloyalty. You're betraying the family. Extreme attachment and extreme identity dependency. You have no, if your family went away, you wouldn't even know who you were in the world. Your entire life is comprised of, your entire self is constructed based upon the responses you get from your other family members. And we can think of these kinds of situations, and I guess not to say that these are families that are overly connected or enmeshed, but in colleges these days we have these things called helicopter parents. Do you know what a helicopter parent is? When they come to college for the first time and the parent is hovering over, just constantly involved. And I used to do first year advising, and one of the first things you learn in first year advising is how to deflect helicopter parents. And the whole advising program, Summer Start, is devised so that you keep the parents out of the children's lives, right? And sometimes that's okay, you know, the children, thank God, I can make my own decisions. But other children, other students, and these are college students, first year college students, are lost. They need to talk to their parents. They can't make decisions without them, okay? And they're texting their parents all day long. It's a little bit on the extreme side. When it really gets extreme, we call them Black Hawk parents.
I had
Black
one
Hawk
of those. My dad was that guy.
Oh, no. But that's only one side. Now the question is, how do you orient back? And that would, you know, you would have to also be part of the system.
Oh yeah, no.
Right? And so that is what would create that. You're able to deflect that. Dad's overly concerned about you.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. But you don't define yourself totally in terms of dad. You've probably been raised in a family in which you've actually been given some levels of autonomy. And so you don't develop that extreme level of attachment. Right? Good example. Thank you for volunteering.
Seriously, that's how it was.
Yeah. Well, it's for a lot.
Yeah.
My daughter still accuses me of it. No, I don't do it too badly. No.
He just uses the excuse, I have 3 daughters, I have to know.
Yeah.
Whatever, Dad.
Yeah. There's a lot of parents like that. The question is how much? And is there some that's too much? And that's where you get into this situation. So in your family, you're probably in the very connected group.
Yeah.
And a lot of it also has to do with your orientation back. Mm-hmm. You know, how well are you able to move without consulting dad? Or, you know, if you're so tied to your family that you can't be anything without them there, then that's problematic. It's problematic for you as an individual. It's also problematic for your family's ability to make any kind of adjustments in the face of any kind of stress or event. They're not going to know. They're not going to be able to move. Because any movement, any deviation is going to disrupt the other person's identity. So in this case, dad's identity will be disrupted if I do this, and then it's going to be problematic for him, and vice versa. And so that would be a case of enmeshment or overly connected family life. Family flexibility, there are 5 levels here as well. 2 of them dysfunctional, 1 of them moderate. Rigid or inflexible families have pretty much autocratic and complete control of one or two members of the family. So children particularly are not allowed to even have inputs in decision making. And in the very extreme case, it's one parent who makes all the decisions. So we can think back to Beaver's tyrannical control situation, right? And strictly defined and enforced roles and rules. That you have a job to do and you're held accountable to do that job. And there's lots of shoulds and shouldn'ts. There's lots of rules in these families. One of the things we know, and we'll talk about this when we talk about measurement, that when we look at single parent families, one of the ways they try to compensate for the lack of a second parent is they create lots of rules for children. And so their means of control is to create rules. And the rules are what control the children. Whereas other families in which they have the luxury of two parents, they tend to be more able to establish sets of principles where the children use to make judgments about what's appropriate or not, depending upon the circumstances, and so they're less rule-bound than the single-parent families. Although some single parents are the opposite, and they have no rules at all, and they have no other means of control. So those are the choices that they have. Another case of it strictly enforced and defined roles and rules would be sometimes extreme conservative religious families develop these sets of rules for behavior, and there is no flexibility involved. There is sanctions for violating the rules, and that's it. And I used to watch this show called Glee. Do you ever see Glee? And there's a case where the cheerleader, the head cheerio, gets pregnant, one of the first ones, right? And she has her boyfriend Finn over for dinner with her parents, and they're going to break the news that she's pregnant, and they kick her out of the house because you can't violate the rule. That would be an extreme kind of rule-bound system, very rigid. No opportunity to negotiate, no opportunity to say, well, okay, that happened, but how do we work with this and still work within the context of the culture of our family and what's important. The middle group is somewhat flexible to very flexible, and after this segment we'll talk about family measurement and you'll see how Olson measures these things. This would be ranging from hierarchical control, a clear hierarchy of who makes decisions, and to a more egalitarian leadership style. So in a very flexible family, you're not going to have anybody telling anybody else what to do. You're going to have people sitting down and generally talking about the merits of different decisions that they could make, and they're not necessarily going to vote on it. One person might have more influence on the process, but there will be input coming from all family members. And that would be a very flexible family system with respect to control. Stable segregated roles, which are negotiated, to interchangeable negotiated roles. So in this case, it would be people would have tasks that they always do, but they would be tasks that weren't necessarily determined by their age or gender. It wouldn't be a stereotype. And again, it would be, in your family, talking about the taking out the garbage. You did it all the time. It was your job, and you were fine with it. It worked for you, and your brother washed the dishes, is that what he did?
Mm-hmm. Dishwasher.
And he was good for that, and it worked. In a sense, it's stable. You did it all the time. Brother never took the trash out. You never did the dishes.
He did.
Well, you did. I know. It could have been that you always did it all the time, in which case it would be stable, and it would have been negotiated. Right? It would have been, yeah, I can do that, and you can do that. That's fine. And once it's set, we'll always do it. To interchangeable negotiated roles, which would be, well, I'll take the trash out most of the time, but if I miss it, you can take it out, and sometimes I'll do the dishes for you, and we can go back and forth. Okay? And we're both okay with it. And mom and dad are okay with it too. The family agrees about it. And so that would be a much more flexible or very flexible kind of family system. And then a system with many and fixed rules, not strictly enforced and defined, but many and fixed rules, to one with fewer and more situational kinds of rules. That we're not going to say you have to behave this way or you have to do these things all the time. We're going to say it depends. Depends upon what you're going through. You know, if you don't want to, if you don't feel like eating your vegetables tonight, you know, and there's a good reason, fine, you don't have to eat your vegetables tonight. Okay? We'll find a way to get the vegetables some other way, or the vitamins some other way. We're okay with it. We want you to get vitamins, and we got to figure out some way for you to do that. But we're not going to say, you know, you're not going to leave this table until every pea is eaten. Okay? And so, some degree, actually, you're going to see that example in the movie Crooklyn. So this would be more fewer and situational rules. And then chaotic and overly flexible. This is a family that's very erratic and with limited leadership and control. In parenting, it would be called a laissez-faire parenting style. Do whatever you want. Just don't disrupt my life. Don't disturb me. Or parents telling a child to do one thing one day and something different the next. Two parents who are telling the children to do different things at different times. Poorly defined roles, lacking consensus. The tasks aren't getting done. And when people do them, they don't really want to do them. And so they wind up with a lot of complaining. And ambiguous and constantly changing rules. What are the rules? What is appropriate? Can I watch this television show tonight? Well, I used to, but now all of a sudden you say I can't, probably because someone with more power wants to watch something different. And by watching what you want to watch, it's getting in your way. And so you never know what are the grounds for what's appropriate behavior. This would be a chaotic, overly flexible system. So you can see, when we look at both cohesion and flexibility, the moderates seem to be the ones. And the principle is togetherness, but also allowing some autonomy. But maybe leaning on the side of more togetherness is good for the system. And then flexibility, having structure, but not so much structure that it gets in the way and that you can't change the way you do things as a family if you need to. And so that's high flexibility is what's most valued. Based on this, Olson comes up with a typology of family systems, just like Beaver did. Says there are three types of families. The balanced families have moderate cohesion and moderate flexibility. They're right there in the middle on both. Okay? So they're right in the middle. In a sense, this is the circumplex model. So a two-dimensional system, cohesion and flexibility, low to high, low to high. What's in the middle? Moderate on both, right? And I have a diagram later I can show you. Mid-range families, not as optimal and maybe have some problems, but sort of muddling along. And they are moderate on cohesion and then either extreme in flexibility, either extremely flexible or extremely rigid. So you're moderate, you're one of those three categories of moderate cohesion, and then you're either really flexible, you're chaotic, or you're rigid on the flexibility dimension. And then the other type of mid-range family is moderate on flexibility. You're one of those three middle groups on flexibility, but you're extreme on cohesion. You're either extremely cohesive, enmeshed, or you're extremely disengaged. Okay. And so those are the conditions that he defines as mid-range families. And then the problematic families are the extreme families. And these are the families that are extreme on both cohesion and disengagement in either direction. So you could have the extremely cohesive extremely flexible family. You could have the extremely cohesive, extremely rigid family, the extremely disengaged, extremely flexible family, and then the extremely disengaged, extremely rigid family. And he says that all four of those combinations occur in the real world based upon his clinical studies. That he finds these are the groups that come in that have the biggest problems and have the less success afterwards. All right, finally, or leading up to finally, Olson, and this is where communication comes in. Olson says, you know, when I did the model, it was all about adaptability, and I wasn't making a distinction between everyday adaptability and adaptability to extreme stressor conditions. But based upon comments and research from other scholars and my own work, verifying it, I actually think it's better to think about two levels of adaptability. And so the first level is what he calls first order adaptability, and that's an adaptational process across contexts, a steady state of family relations that manages day-to-day challenges. And so you can classify families on the cohesion and flexibility scales, and the moderates are going to be the ones that on a day-to-day basis, they work the best. For all those normal, everyday changes that families experience, they seem to manage them better than families that are in the extremes. However, sometimes families face extreme conditions, and those extreme conditions might mean that the family has to change its organizational structure in a way that otherwise would not have been classified as functional. Sometimes, for example, it's advantageous for a family to become very, very rigid. Or it's advantageous for a family to become really, really cohesive. What might create those kinds of conditions? According to Olson, some extreme kind of disruption. Usually what happens, for example, in his research on, he did some studies of families in which the father had a heart attack. What do those families go through? Well, initially, they go through letting go of their organization completely. They become very chaotic, but they become extremely cohesive. They just are focused on each other to an extreme degree, more than they normally would be or that you would say would be healthy. And then, as the event goes on, and as recovery of the individual starts to happen, you see those families loosen up a bit, give their members more autonomy, and then start to develop more structure. And so, how is a family able to do that? To go from one steady state into some emergency condition and then back to a new steady state. And he says the only way that you can do that is through communication. And so communication patterns in families become very important because that's what facilitates an ability to change the family goals and processes to address more substantial changes in environmental conditions. Sometimes you have to reorganize. Goals too. You have to be able to say, well, we were going in this direction, but the hurricane took our house out to sea. We have to refocus ourselves. We have to come up with a new set of goals. And sometimes, you know, we're all disrupted by this. And maybe it's best if one person makes all those decisions, at least initially, so that we can get through our current condition and then proceed to get back to some normality. How is that possible for a family to do that? Olson says, well, first of all, if it has moderate to high cohesion, moderate to high flexibility to begin with, it's going to be more, that's going to facilitate it to some degree. But what's really going to be critical is its communication patterns. And so he talks about communication as a combination of skills and disclosure patterns that you find in families. It ranges from speaking skills, which refers to the ability to articulate feelings and thoughts appropriate to a situation, How well are you able to articulate what's going on? Listening skills, having empathy with another person, and active listening. So empathy is being able to understand what the other person is going through, what their emotional conditions are, what their perspectives are. And active listening is an actual communication process in which members engage in certain kinds of communicative acts to make sure that they're getting the message correctly. And so one example of active listening would be paraphrasing. So say, I say something to you and you say, so are you saying that, which a good student does, right? Active listening is active learning. So you're saying that, and rephrasing it, that confirms that you understood what the message is and that the sender knows that you understood what they intended, right? And they can correct it if it's wrong or if it's not consistent with what they are trying to convey. Another kind of active listening is where you, what's called perception checking. And this doesn't have to do with the message or the instrumental aspect of the message. It has more to do with the meaning of the message with respect to self. So if I say, you know, last night you really caused, let's say, last night, you know, you really made our daughter feel bad. And my wife comes back and says, are you saying that I'm not a good parent? That's a kind of active listening. What's the meaning behind what you said with respect to how you perceive who I am? So it's perception checking. I'm checking on your perception of me based upon what you said. Right? So it's less about the obvious manifest meaning of the communication and more about what we might call a latent meaning, an underlying meaning. So families that do a lot of have empathy and a lot of active listening, those are families that would rate higher on communication. Self-disclosure, families in which there's a lot of sharing of feelings about the self and the relationships in the family, where people talk about how they feel about things that have happened, both in their day-to-day lives as well as in their family lives. They talk about the nature of their relationships. You know, we've been not getting along too well lately. Huh? We haven't been talking as much lately. That's self-disclosure, feelings about the relationship. Tracking, staying on topic. How easy is it? Is this family that keeps on going from one topic to another, or can they really focus in on their communications? Do they listen? And that's a product of listening to each other and following up on things that people say, as opposed to switching topics all the time. And then finally, respect and regard. Being open to other people's expressions. A family with respect and regard is one that poses the question a lot. How are you feeling? What are you thinking? Tell me what you're feeling. Right? And when you do tell me what I'm thinking, what you're thinking, I respond with, well, that's interesting, or that's valid. I can see your point of view. I might not agree with you, but I understand what you're going through and what the situation is. That would be respect and regard. So families that demonstrate these 5 sets of communication skills in their day-to-day interactions, when they encounter traumatic situations, they do better. One good study that was done a few years ago was in Korea about making end-of-life decisions for a terminally ill cancer patient who's a member of your family. Which families did better? Well, guess what? The families with high cohesion and the families with who scored higher communication skills. Okay? They were the ones that were able to make decisions and in a timely manner. Okay, so that's Olson's systems model. It's called the circumplex model. It's called a circumplex because You can think of a two-dimensional space, a big quadrant, a square, and from low to high on both dimensions. And then in the middle, those are the moderates. And so that middle circle is the functional group. And so it's a circumplex. Or so he phrases it. Any questions about it? Does it make any sense to you? Mm-hmm. And do you see any connections? Maybe I think when we're done with measurement, we'll come back and sort of think about these models and how they relate to each other. You know, can you see some of what Beaver talks about in what Olson talks about? Even though Beaver was really more focused on goal attainment and Olson's talking about adaptability. To a large degree, it's all about the structuring of how things get done and the level of togetherness and autonomy that exists in systems. And they're in all the models. Olson is a little bit more flexible. He's a little bit more open to a broader range of functional family life. He doesn't see that you could tell a family how to do things, how to arrange their relationships, except to tell them whatever way you arrange it, make sure that you have some flexibility in there, that you do negotiation, that you don't have too much cohesion, that you have some autonomy and you don't have too much autonomy. And as long as you preserve that balance, you're going to be able to be okay. You're going to be able to make adjustments in your day-to-day life. You might not make the most optimal decisions as a family, but you're going to get through and you're going to manage your lives and people are going to come out okay. It's when you get into these extremes that you're going to run into problems.